Muraho, Namaskara, and Chimripsua, everyone. Welcome back. We're at the end of the road. It's the last dance, the last call, the final countdown. The party's over. Well, as they say, all good things have to come to an end. But we've got one final module, and this is the one that you've all been waiting for. That's right, it's the grand finale. It's the logical framework. It all comes down to this. So, in this module, we're going to finally be discussing the logical framework, which is the structure of your actual project. Now, you may recall that in the introduction to this whole course, I told you that I like to save the logical framework for last. And this is in contrast to some other project designers that like to jump right into the logical framework and start designing immediately. And then they work backwards to the problem identification. We started with problem identification, and now we're working towards a logical framework. And I think that as we work through this module, you'll understand why we did this. You'll understand the advantages of having a well-defined problem and problem formulation and a good theory of change, because this helps the logical framework almost write itself. But if you don't know what a logical framework is, fear not, and just sit tight because we'll explain it in a few minutes. So let's start off talking about what a logical framework actually is. Now on this slide, you can see that the concept note template requires you to describe the expected set of components and activities to address the above barriers identified that will lead to the expected outcomes. That's what the question says. And that means that they want you to describe the steps that you will take to address the barriers that you outlined in your barriers analysis that came from your problem tree. So the components are the biggest piece of your project. They correspond to the major changes that your project will achieve and which are necessary to achieve your project's goal or objective. So you can think of them as the chapters of your project. Each of the components tells their own smaller story of change that contributes to the overall bigger change that your project will make happen. And then we have the activities, and these are the specific actions that your project will implement. This is things like workshops, extension services, establishing regulations, that sort of thing, the actions. We'll come back to the specific language and terminology in a little bit because it's important. But right now, we want to present this information in a structured sort of way, like a procedure for bringing about the change that you described in your theory of change. So this is where the logical framework or the log frame come in. The log frame is like a blueprint for your project. I think most of us know what a blueprint is. You can see the image of one we took from Wikipedia on the slide here. The blueprint is really a tool of communication. It allows the architect who designs the house or the building to tell the engineers and the builders exactly how to build the house, the steps to take. As the project designer, you are like an architect. You need to communicate first to the funder what supplies you need to build a project. And you also need to communicate to the implementation team and also to the funder the steps in making the project happen, the procedure. So you can think of the logical framework as a way to describe the procedure to implement your theory of change. Remember, the theory of change describes the process, but the procedure to make that process happen, that's the logical framework. And it's an important part of the design process. Now in this slide, you can see a generalized model for a logical framework. And I emphasize that this is a generalized model. Not all logical frameworks look like this, but this is reasonably close to what the GCF logical framework model looks like. It's not exactly the same, but it's very close. And we use this to illustrate the basic outline of a logical framework. And I will explain each of these terms and each of the cells on the matrix in the next slide. But as you can see up at the top, we have the project objective, and the project objective is a short statement of the goal of your project. And this basically comes from the center of your objective tree. And then we've got our project impacts, and this is, as you can see on the slide, a description of the longer-term contribution that your project will make to improve livelihoods and the betterment of the community. Now, your project does not make these things happen, but these are things that your project contributes to. And then we have our outcomes. You see outcome 1 and 2, and these are the changes that your project creates. And underneath the outcome is an output. And beneath the outputs are the activities. And so you may have several outputs for each outcome, and you may have several activities for each output. Now, you can see on this slide that we also have baseline, indicator, targets, risk, and assumptions. This is part of monitoring and evaluation. And at the concept note stage, this is not as important as it is later on in the design process. So here is a diagram that I like to use to describe the pieces of the log frame. And we're going to talk through this. So here you can see the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And they're all laid out. And you can read the description. The inputs are the resources that you will need for your project. This is things like money, expertise, meetings and facilities, meeting facilities, printing, utilities, and those sorts of things. Now, at the concept note stage, we don't have to focus too heavily on inputs. You just need a rough estimate as to how much things cost at this point. But the important thing is to remember that you need the inputs to make your project work. Inputs are like the gas or petrol that makes your car go. So if you have the inputs, then you can do the activities. Activities are just like the name sounds. They are actions that your project takes to make the change in your theory of change happen. Workshops, trainings, providing people with efficient cook stoves, or developing a demonstration plot for climate smart agriculture, or building a demonstration climate resilient house, carpenters trainings, those sorts of things. So those are all activities. So once we're finished with activities, we move to the outputs. Outputs are goods and services that the project provides through the activities. If you do the activities, then you will be able to deliver some goods and services. So those are the outputs. Sometimes the outputs are obvious. For example, a vulnerability assessment. That's an output. It's a good. It's a product that your project produces through several activities. Like, for example, village stakeholder consultations, village mapping exercises, a desk review of the area of interest, and so forth. Those are activities that would contribute to the output of a vulnerability assessment. All of these activities go together to give you the output of a vulnerability assessment. But sometimes we have to define the goods and services more broadly. So for example, if I have several activities like set up a village demonstration plot for climate smart agriculture, prepare training materials for villagers for climate smart agriculture, recruit champion farmers, and incorporate climate change into agriculture extension services, then the good or service I make with my project is that farmers are trained up in climate smart agriculture. So you see, the ability to apply climate smart agriculture is a product. That's a product that my project has created. So you usually have 2 to 7 activities per output, but that's not always the case. So if I make goods and services, the outputs, then I can expect the participants to benefit in certain ways. I can expect the problem situation to change if I do these outputs. This is what the outcomes are. The outcomes are the changes that result from a project's outputs. Outcomes usually come from around 2 to 5 outputs, but it could be more or it could be less. So for example, a moment ago I mentioned a vulnerability assessment as an output. Other outputs may be prioritized adaptation measures or setting up a village resilience committee. If I create all of these outputs, then I might expect the village to incorporate climate change vulnerabilities and risks into village level planning. So this would be a change. That would be a change in the behavior of the village. We would be moving from a situation where the villagers do not plan for climate change and are therefore vulnerable to a situation where they are planning for climate change and are therefore less vulnerable. So that's important. It's a change in village behavior for the better. Another example, let's think about the farmers that we train to do climate smart agriculture. Now, if we provide some complementary outputs like a village seed bank or a nursery and a village level financing program like a microfinance or microcredit program, something like that, and maybe some basic insurance to build confidence among the farmers in the new seed varieties, then we might expect the villagers to adopt the climate smart agriculture practices. That would be an important outcome. It's a change in the farmer's behavior. But the key thing is a change in the behavior. If the farmers do not adopt the practices, you may provide them with the services, but if they don't adopt the practices, the outcome has not been successful. You've provided the output, but the outcome is not successful. Lastly, we have the impacts. Now, the impacts are the broader changes in society that result from the outcomes. Generally, there are 1 to 3 outcomes per project, but there could be more. Some impacts are things like improved rural food security and livelihoods, or reduced losses and damage from slow and sudden onset climate events. The important thing to understand here is that the impacts are bigger than your project. They are different from the outcomes. So your project makes the outcomes happen, and so by the end of the project, you should be able to observe and document the outcome. But impacts are bigger changes and they're longer term. So your project will contribute to these larger changes in society, but most likely will not bring about them on its own. You might not be able to fully observe the impacts by the end of the project. So for example, a reduction in rural poverty may be an impact of your project. But in many cases, your project does not, it cannot be expected by itself to bring about a reduction in rural poverty. So that's the basic idea behind the log frame. Now, we will have a demonstration video in this module, and we also have an exercise to help you develop your logical framework. You don't have to have a fully developed logical framework at the concept node stage, but it helps to have the basic structure laid out at this point. Now, in this module, we're also going to cover some other odds and ends, some of the implementation arrangements for your concept node, and some of the administrative parts. We'll talk about some considerations also for monitoring and evaluation. At the concept node stage, you really don't have to have your monitoring and evaluation fully developed, but there are some key considerations, and we'll show you what those are so that you can incorporate them into your own concept node. And we'll talk about them too. We'll explain them. We'll talk about the implementation arrangements for your project. This refers to what's going on in the project, who's going to handle what, which agencies or NGOs or which stakeholders are going to handle which parts of the project. It also includes describing the strengths of the accredited entity and the executing entities, why they're well suited to do the project. So this gives you a chance to brag about how great your organization is and all the good things that it does and how it's absolutely the perfect organization to do the project and how happy the GCF is going to be with the results from your organization. So that does it for this final module. Let's head over to the tutorial to have a more in-depth look at these topics. And make sure you check out the demonstration video on the logical framework that we've developed, where we talk through a couple of examples and show you how to actually structure a logical framework and do your own for your concept note. And this will give you the basic steps on a logical framework and set you up for your own concept note. So there's also an exercise and a worksheet to guide you through the process of developing your own logical framework. And lastly, make sure to check out the auxiliary resources that we've included in the references section for this module. There's a lot of useful information about developing a logical framework and monitoring and evaluation and some other issues. So murakoze mahalo. Dhanyavada and Arkun for all your kind attention throughout the whole entire module and seeing it through to the end. You should be proud of yourself. It's been a long journey and a lot of work. You've done a great job and it's been a pleasure to be with you. So we really hope that you've learned a lot and this has been worth your time and your effort and that you feel confident to develop a fundable concept note. Until next time, goodbye.